Okay, I'd like to introduce, how should I do this? Look into the camera. I'd like to introduce Jamie DeMarco. He grew up in Baltimore, member of Homewood Friends Meeting, went to school in North Carolina. He attended Asheville Friends Meeting, now lives in College Park and attends a Delphi meeting. He's worked for Friends Committee on National Legislation, focusing on nuclear disarmament and Pentagon spending issues, mostly works on addressing the climate crisis. He's worked at the Maryland Clean Energy Jobs Initiative, Citizens Climate Lobby, and is now the Federal Policy Director for the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. And then another interesting thing that I had discovered about him is that he spent 2 years not getting into a car. He traveled only by foot or by bicycle. So here is Jamie DeMarco.
Thanks so much for that introduction. And thanks for inviting me to be on today. I wish I could be there in person, but it seems like most people are on Zoom anyway. So maybe this works better. I'll say at the top that I am not an expert on peace issues or Quaker advocacy and peace. So I just did a lot of Googling for this. But still am tickled that I was asked to speak. And I'll just set the goal of trying to throw out some ideas, a little bit of history, a little bit of the current state of conflict in the world, and open us up to some discussions about what we can be doing with our time right now. And I am going to share screen. Can everyone see this okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, so I think global conflict and war, and of course we know peace is not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice, but war itself and our efforts to end it have been on everyone's minds lately. In particular, because of the conflict in Ukraine, where we continue to see a humanitarian crisis and potential war crimes, potential genocide being committed by Russia against the Ukrainian people. But of course, it's not the only place where there's conflict in the world. The war in Afghanistan raged for 20 years, and the conflict there continues even after the United States has pulled out. Israel-Palestine conflict continues, and we've seen new outbreaks of violence in that conflict recently. And then lesser talked about conflicts such as the civil war in Yemen. This is a photo from Yemen in that civil war. And then even less talked about conflicts such as the civil war in Ethiopia that's been raging for the past year and a half. And this is a map of conflict, armed conflict, and state conflict around the world. And I think we as friends do what we can and do a good job of holding the hard truth of this world in conflict in our hearts and doing what we can to lessen it and bring a world more full of peace without the threat of war, free from war and the threat of war around the world. And so I'm now going to jump into a little bit of what Quakers have done historically and build up to what we are doing now to help make sure our world is more free from war and the threat of war. So from early on in American Quaker history, Quaker Americans have been advocating against conflict and war. This is New Garden Friends School in North Carolina, where first of all, Quakers opposed the Revolutionary War and were able to avoid serving in it, but had to pay higher taxes as a result. And in the courthouse battle in North Carolina during the Revolutionary War, Quakers served as medics to soldiers on both sides, including treating more than 250 British soldiers. And of course, if as much as we now celebrate an independent America, if America had not broken off from a colony from England, then we would have eliminated slavery much earlier when England did, and maybe even without a civil war. So those early Quakers were maybe onto something opposing that Revolutionary War. Jumping ahead to the First World War, Quakers were conscientious objectors at a time when it was illegal to be against the war. Despite the First Amendment, it was illegal to even speak up publicly and say that you opposed it. And many people were put in prison for refusing to serve and for opposing the war. This is a placard from 1919 highlighting the fact that conscientious objectors are still in prison and have not been set free 3 years after they were first put in prison for opposing that first Great War. And then leading ahead of the Second World War, Friends traveled to Germany to try and intercede on behalf of Jews. This is something I did not actually know before my Googling for this piece. And during the war, a 1941 reporter stated that the Quakers were feeding 7,200 adult refugees and 800 children daily in camps and hospitals in Europe. So this is real on-the-ground field work. It's trying to alleviate the suffering of those in active conflict right now. And I think that this spirit of serving those who are receiving the brunt of war is something that Quakers continue to do today. And that has spread beyond the Quaker community and become more of a norm, where now see people at the Ukrainian border as Ukrainians fleeing crisis arrive at the border. They're just people waiting to take folks into their home and driving refugees back. And I know that a Delphi Friends meeting has been feeding a family who have fled Afghanistan when the Taliban took it over after the United States left. And for a long time before that family was able to get its food stamps up and running, Quaker Meeting was just feeding it potluck style, and I think is now providing it many of the school supplies it needs for, I think, 8 children. And I think Quaker Meetings are doing similar things across the state and across the country. So this is something we've historically done and continue to do. After the Second World War, Quakers were some of the first to oppose nuclear weapons after they were used in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and to campaign for the abolishment of nuclear weapons along with the rest of the nuclear disarmament movement. And Quakers were, of course, at the heart of the anti-Vietnam movement and had a central role in that, from my understanding. Maybe other people on this call have more direct knowledge of that than I do. In the wake of 9/11, Quakers were some of the only voices for peace and opposing war. I think the Friends Committee on National Legislation is the only advocacy group who sent out an action alert opposing the congressional vote for an authorization for the use of military force in the wake of 9/11, just in the days between that event and when the United States overthrew the government in Afghanistan. And I think we should be very proud of how prescient we were. Of course, we all know that was a 20-year-long war with countless losses, and we left and the Taliban control it still. And it's hard to argue that it was the right choice to start that war, despite near consensus in the country at the time that it was the right choice. I think our Quaker leadings were very prescient. And the war is not the answer sign had a sort of, before the internet had the term viral, sort of became viral in yard signs across the country. And I think Quaker voice was being heard in that way. And today, Quakers continue to advocate through many different forms for the United States to end war and our involvement in war. This is a picture of advocacy teams with the Friends Committee on National Legislation, chapters across the country who lobbied the US government to end our use of war and conflict and violence. Specifically, we have been working very hard for many years to stop US support for the Saudi war in Yemen. This has been a humanitarian crisis going on for many, many years. And I'm not the most up to date on congressional votes, but my understanding is Congress has either voted to or is very close to having the votes to stop US sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia for this war. Maybe someone else can give a more informed update after that, but that is active advocacy that our community has engaged in and at times been a leader in. The American Friends Service Committee is also working across the world to build peace and reconciliation. This is a photo from North Korea where they have agricultural programs that are on the ground in North Korea, trying to build understanding and reconciliation and work towards peace in the Korean Peninsula, which, it's no joke to be on the ground in North Korea, and that is work that Friends are doing today. And Friends are out here right now in the past 2 months, working hard to prevent World War III. We're here to support Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. We want to see an independent Ukraine. And we know that a no-fly zone over Ukraine could easily lead to a third world war, which none of us want to see. And I think the voices who have been speaking up in the United States against a no-fly zone have helped back up President Biden's decision to not have a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And as we continue to work to avoid violence without the threat of war, one piece of information I found particularly compelling is that, well, I'll get to that later. So what I'd like to say now is that Quakers have been advocating for a world free from war and the threat of war since our inception for hundreds of years. And I think it's worth asking the question, do we have a more peaceful world now than we did when Quakerism was founded? Are we winning this campaign or not? Or what is this sort of trend lines? And this first graph shows the percentage of years in a given time period where world powers, mega powers, superpowers, are at war with each other. And it's from 1500 all the way to now. I'm not sure if folks in the room can see this graph.
We can see it, yeah.
Great. And you can see that for, from 1500 through 1700, world powers were at war with each other almost all the time. And now it is being very rare, in this century, we haven't really had a war between major powers, and that is anomalous. And it didn't happen by accident. There's been a movement to shape global opinion around war that Quakers have been leading, continue to lead, that has shaped the direction of this line. Zooming in now in the post-World War II time period, this is a graph of deaths from global conflict in the post-World War II time period. And again, you can see that today there are fewer people dying from state-based conflicts and violence than there were in the past. And that, if World War III breaks out, maybe that will change. But you can see this sort of graph also has a steady decline. And even as we see peaks in violence in the Middle East and deaths from violence in the Middle East, they still pale in comparison to the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and of course the World War II before that. And the kinds of wars we're fighting are also changing. So this is a graph showing the number of deaths per conflict. So the number of conflicts is also decreasing, and the kind of conflict is decreasing. And this is something I'm going to come back to later, where the blue bar represents conflicts between states, and the red bar is civil conflicts with foreign state intervention. So like what the 20-year war in Afghanistan is one of those, but a civil conflict where a foreign state is intervening. The actual war between the Afghanistan government and the United States was very short. We toppled their government very quickly and then had 20 years of civil conflict. But you can see that the number of conflicts between states has been decreasing over the past decades. Of course, that's one reason that everyone is so sort of transfixed at watching the Russia-Ukraine conflict is because that is just not the kind of conflict that we have seen very much of in the 21st century, of two states in active war with each other. And so the kind of warfare we tend to see is now different than it was before. And then this is on nuclear weapons. When I worked at FCNL, I was transfixed by this graph. I had never known before how many nuclear weapons were once made and how many have now been eliminated. And I think it is worth celebrating the victory that Quakers and the anti-nuclear movement have had, that no nuclear weapons have been used in conflict since World War II. And that, of course, was not a predetermined conclusion. Nuclear powers such as the United States have been defeated by non-nuclear powers. In North Korea and the Taliban both defeated us in combat, and we refused to use nuclear weapons despite losing those conflicts. And that is because of the taboo around nuclear weapons that has been developed from the grassroots to global leaders across the globe. And so I share these graphs in part to give us a sense of what the current state of play of conflict in the world, and to reinforce that when we work for peace, we can make a more peaceful world and reduce deaths from conflict around the world. And that we should keep doing what Quakers have always done because it is working, and because a world free from war, I don't know, I believe that the time between now and when Quakerism was founded is longer than the amount of time between now and when there is a world free from war and the threat of war. I think we will get there, and I think we have to keep working for it every day. One thing that I found particularly compelling, I was going to reference this slide earlier, but I forgot the order of my slides, is that ahead of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Xi Jinping asked Putin not to invade Ukraine until after the Olympics were over. And that ended up spoiling a lot of Russia's tactics, in part because it's much easier to move tanks in an invasion when the ground is frozen. And Russia had been hoping to have most of the conflict finished by the time the ground thawed. But if he was delayed for months because Xi Jinping said, no, 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 you cannot invade Russia, or you cannot invade Ukraine until after the Olympics are over. And I'm so compelled by the notion that, you know, all the tanks in the Ukrainian army were not able to deter Russia. All the threats of sanctions from across the world were not able to deter Russia. But a big convention where a bunch of people played games was able to deter Russia for months. And it makes me think about how can we become more creative in our efforts to prevent war? What if at the end of the Olympics, we had a second Olympics and held it in Ukraine? Would Russia still have invaded then? And I wonder what else we can do to keep that going. And so one thing we can do is join advocacy teams with Friends Committee on National Legislation. I think there is a shrinking portion of the United States population that prioritizes international peace as a sort of voting issue and an issue that they advocate on. And the FCNL advocacy teams is an incredible network of grassroots power that is making a real difference in Congress and US foreign policy to reduce conflict. Because as we saw, state-to-state conflict is reducing. The main drivers of conflict now are these sort of imperialist countries of the world trying to have quote unquote regime change in other countries, and then engaging in civil conflict with those who didn't want that regime change. And so we, as a major military power, with by far the biggest military, have the biggest opportunity to make sure that there are not wars in the future. And I think we as American friends have a great opportunity to lobby our government, something that few other people in the world have an opportunity to do as a citizen of this country. And I really like the advocacy teams and want to make a pitch for joining them. And that is what I prepared. And thanks, friends, very much for listening. I hope I did what I was supposed to do. I was a little confused about what exactly friends were looking for.
Yes, that was very interesting. That's a lot of surprising graphics. The number of warheads, that was a really surprising. It's surprising to see trends and see changes like that. To see that there is an effect of constant work and constant effort. That's pretty cool. Are there any questions?
My name is Paul. I worked with Greenpeace for quite a while in the DC area, all over the Chesapeake Bay. Wondering what you're doing locally, as it were, including green and peace issues.
Well, personally, I work at the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. Again, I don't really work on peace issues, work on climate issues, which of course are related, but I've been working for the past year and a half on trying to get a reconciliation bill through that would, help, that would basically ensure President Biden could meet his goal of cutting US emissions in half by 2030, which of course is tied to conflict because once the world is entirely on clean renewable energy and using that energy to power every part of our society, we won't have as many oil, coal, and gas-driven conflicts. But that's what I've been working on. And it's my understanding that someone else was going to lead the discussion after this presentation.
I guess that's me, and I'd like to lead the discussion. So let's see. One of the ways that we can see the peace testimony is in conflict resolution, which is kind of one of the strengths I think that Quakers have. And a big part of it is just listening. I remember reading a while ago about what did Quakers do in Nazi Germany during World War II, and they actually tried to listen to specific people, and that actually is an incredibly powerful activity to pursue. So I'm wondering, well, for example, taking the war in Ukraine, it doesn't look like Putin is listening to people right now, and he's just he's come up with a plan. He wrote a paper like 2 years ago that said Ukraine is not a country, and he thinks he can continue on with that approach. I wonder if maybe each of us could think about a conflict that they've had and then a way to resolve that conflict, just as kind of an exercise. Maybe that would be a useful way to look at conflict resolution, because whenever there's a choice, whenever we do something, whenever we take an action or make a decision, there's choices involved, and just resolving the choices, coming up with a decision can be difficult. So I think conflict resolution can be, just two people arguing really fiercely and loudly with each other, or it can be just a difference in opinion about a decision. So I don't know, maybe we could do, each of us could take like a minute and talk about a conflict that they've had and about how they've been able to resolve the conflict. That might be a way to do that.
Robin?
Yeah.
This is Ellen Atkinson on Zoom, and I would like to stick with the idea that Jamie has presented about Quakers and the peace testimony, because one of the things that connects the environment with peace is that war is not green. And also, if you look at the budget in the US, of the amount of money now that's going for nuclear weapons is huge in order to create newer, quote, better nuclear weapons. And I think we have a long, long way to go before this United States is going to become a peaceful place. Not on so many fronts, and perhaps this is too big, but my interest is in eliminating nuclear weapons in the United States and around the world. And they are now illegal according to the UN treaty, which was passed in 2021. However, the 9 states that have nuclear weapons are not signatories to that treaty. 60 other countries, smaller countries mostly, that are terribly afraid of nuclear weapons in the hands of these large countries like China, Russia. There are 9 of them. I probably don't need to name them all for you. And I guess I'm sounding a bit belligerent, but I feel this so strongly, and I would like to see a discussion about the peace testimony not relate to individual conflict, but a conflict between individuals. I realize that's important, and that Lee Stern and Ruth Stern, who lived at Friend's house, Lee was very strong in the alternatives to violence actions. And maybe some of you here have participated in alternatives to violence. It's been used in prisons and in other areas. I know Betty Hoover, for instance, has been very active in training in that. And it is important how we deal with conflicts on a individual level. But as a nation, we are extremely violent. And until we can eliminate our dependence on militarism in this country, in our economy, what is it in our budget that gets the most money? It's not education. It's not healthcare. It's not facing climate chaos head on. Anyway, thank you for listening. That's what I really wanted to say, and feel free, Robin, to continue in whatever way you feel best. Thank you.
Oh, that sounds like a great direction to go in.
There's probably not enough time for the personal sharing like that.
Sure.
Just maybe we could come back. I'd like to ask Jamie to follow up on what Ellen said. Jamie, can you speak about the environmental impacts of military actions?
I am not an expert on the environmental impacts of military actions. There's probably others on this call who know more about that than I do. I know from my work on that nuclear ban that the previous friend was sharing that when nuclear weapons were being tested, they were tested in Pacific Islands, and that the radiological effects of those testings are still happening, are still ongoing. And that the U.S. military system is one of the single biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. But beyond that, those are the top line talking points that I'm familiar with.
This question is sort of blends Robin's question with Ellen's. If I can ask, I've been wondering about travel in an airplane, given the climate change. And I'm wondering whether or not it's a very Quakerly thing to get on a plane and go places with all the power, all the fuel usage. And I know there are Quakers around the world who say, I'm not traveling anymore except by train or buses. I wonder from a climate perspective and from a peace testimony perspective, Do you have anything you could share on that?
Thanks for that question. And this is something that I've thought a lot about. And as I was referenced in my introduction, I did spend 2 years where I wasn't even riding in a car. I would take public transportation and make occasional exceptions, but for the most part, I wasn't getting in a car. And mainly what I took away was that change will come when we all get involved as much as we can in systematic change and policy change. Bill McKibben has a great quote that if the 5% of the US population that cares most deeply about these issues completely eliminated our carbon footprint, then economic growth would replace our impact in a short number of years. But if the 5% of us that cared most deeply about this issue became as politically and civically engaged as humanly possible, then we would transform the world. And that is always what I tried to lead with. I think that there's a lot of wisdom in what, oh shoot, what's his name? I don't know why I'm blanking. The founder of Pennsylvania. William Penn. Thank you. When William Penn asked George Fox, like, should I continue to wear this sword, which, you know, is customary for me to wear a sword at my hip as a member of royalty, or should I not wear this sword? And George Fox said, wear it as long as you can. And I've always loved that because it speaks to meaning, like, if you can't wear it anymore, stop wearing it. But if you can, keep wearing it. And I think it leads to a message of lead with joy. And if you find more joy abstaining from something, then seek that route. But I don't think that I don't think that we should be making ourselves miserable to deny ourselves the ability to see our loved ones and such, because the fossil fuel industry knew about this crisis in the 80s. Their own scientists decided it was conclusive evidence, and then they spent 4 decades systematically lying and blocking climate action, which is why we are here today. None of us are at fault. It is the fault of these corporations that knew and lied. And I don't think we should spend too much time beating ourselves up. That said, I try not to fly on airplanes. But that said, I am actually flying on one to New Mexico in a week. So I'm not sure what the takeaway is there.
Thank you.
Speaking of the big corporations, I just saw a program. I knew this already, that Exxon devoted a significant research effort to find out what is happening with climate change in, I believe, the 70s. And they had real scientists working on this, finding out, estimating how CO2, because it also related to investigations of Venus and finding out that Venus had an atmosphere, mostly, I guess, sulfuric acid and very high temperature, I think 800 degrees Fahrenheit, because it also had a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere. It was just a great example. It really shows that CO2 is great at trapping photons and turning it into heat on the planet. So they had this research, and they actually had divisions that were going to look into solar energy. They had different footprints in different areas that were going to respond and lead the way in climate change. And then they just suddenly stripped that away. They cut the funding and decided to go into the world of climate denier. And then the Koch brothers got involved because Clinton thought, let's have a gas tax, and that would impact their company, which was providing everything needed that refiners needed. And so that's when the Koch brothers decided to become these major contributors to the Republican Party now, which they got involved because they didn't want to see this big tax added to them. So And then I think you also alluded to the idea of the oil and gas wars that, certainly Kuwait, the Desert Storm war, there's so many wars in the Middle East that are involving control of oil and gas. The Ukraine war is involving movement of oil and gas to Europe from Russia. I don't know, can you speak to that aspect of maybe oil and gas relating to war?
Yes. I think it's very clear that Russia's number one economic export, where the majority of its money in international sales across its entire economy comes from coal, oil, and gas. So this is a petro-funded war that Russia is having. And of course, NATO's ability to respond is muted by the fact that they are fearful of Russia turning off the gas pipes that Europe gets a lot of its gas for domestic heating and electricity production from Russia. And I think that's something that all of us have learned in these past 2 months as this war has raged. And we know that the Biden administration is kind of having the wrong response in this moment, where it's trying to double down on gas production in order to offset oil from Russia, when what we should be doing is, instead of exporting more gas, is exporting heat pumps. Heat pumps, of course, can heat and cool your home for less than the cost to heat it with gas and cool it with air conditioning. And the more we use it, they run entirely on electricity, which can be powered by wind and solar. So what we should be doing is making sure we're powering our society without fossil fuels and then electrifying everything. And that would lead to fewer wars. So I think you're absolutely right that there's a connection.
I'll just say I just saw something on a news show about the Rockefeller Foundation sending, like all these green energy items to countries or areas of countries in need, and how many they'll send 1 million things and it'll be 5 billion, units of energy that they're going to save, by doing this. So it's something to look at about how we can be proactive in developing countries mindfully. And I think about when we get back to peace, that, I think we know that when we're in Quaker meeting and we're quiet and calm, that we have a sense of well-being in our bodies. And we used to think, for pregnant people, that the only stress that would cause a baby to have health effects from the stress was if the mom was in a war zone. But now we know about generational stress, and just the low level stress of every day actually will create negative outcomes for that baby's stress level and health level throughout its life. So it's really important that we cultivate peace, in every level, and not just think about, it is important to be proactive so that the big things don't happen, but we also have to maybe start with finding peace for ourselves and then teaching others to find peace, and how costly it is to not do it for everything, for the environment, for our health, for our well-being, for our world. And, ethically, obviously, it's really no good to be, allowing people to be murdered, which is what's happening in this big conflict. And I know it's a lot of it has to do with power grabs or power struggles. And I don't know how we I've always thought that socialism was like the best form of governance, except for human beings are greedy and we can't get rid of greed. So I'm not sure how we can move forward. But I think what just in our intention and what we talk about is really important.
Okay.
I have a couple of thoughts. Oh, are you trying to end?
Sure.
Should I go ahead or are you trying to end?
Go ahead. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. One series of thoughts has to do with the impact of global warming on wars of the future. Sorry to sound pessimistic about this, but as we continue to see the impacts of climate change and the dislocations of both natural disasters and droughts and all these things that sometimes compound a conflict situation like in Syria, that we've seen these dislocations causing massive migration, which then fuels the ethnic hatred and gives rise to right-wing fanaticism, and makes us more and more vulnerable to wars. So I'd be interested in Jamie's thoughts on that. I wanted to say also, though, the history was interesting, reflecting on World War II. My dad was a conscientious objector in World War II, and I was born in 52. So I grew up kind of wondering how hard it had been for him to take a stand, that meant not standing up to Nazism. And my mother's Jewish, but her family's Jewish. And then during the Vietnam War, the war itself seemed so completely unjustifiable that it was no question that, whether from a pacifist or a purely political stance, it just seemed completely wrong. Now with this Ukrainian war, I have to say, I'm increasingly perplexed as to how, there's this obvious aggressor. I don't want to advocate a military response to him, but he's murdering thousands and thousands of people. It seems more similar to Hitler than Vietnam, I guess, but it's harder and harder for me to think of creative solutions to solve this. Obviously I'm not in a position to have to think of them. I don't work, in the foreign policy and fair government. But so anyhow, those are the two strains of thoughts. If Jamie has anything on either of them, or if anybody else does.
I'd certainly be curious to hear what others think. I don't know, I've thought about these questions a lot too. My grandfather did serve in World War II. He wasn't Quaker and got a Purple Heart on D-Day. And I often wonder about whether I would serve if called to serve in World War II. And it's hard to know what to do now in the Ukraine crisis. And I don't want Russia to consume and end independent Ukraine. And it's hard to think of what to do to stop his advance. And I think that the truth I keep coming back to is that pacifism really doesn't offer a lot of valuable or palatable solutions when an army is at your door, but pacifism is more about preventing the army from arriving at your door. So when that army has arrived, we have sort of already lost because there are no good options left, in the same way that people, keep a gun in their house to hope, they justify it by saying, what if someone breaks into your house? And of course, we know insurance companies have found that if you have a gun in your house, you're much more likely to harm yourself or your loved one by accident than you are to actually deter someone else breaking into your house. But the work is making sure that there's no one who would break into your house because they have everything they need. And if they have a mental health crisis, they have the mental health services they need, so they're not breaking into your house. So you don't actually need that gun. In the same way, we are trying to create a world where countries don't go to war, or if they do, the people of the world don't allow them. I mean, I think it's happening less now, but certainly early on, we saw lots of Russian troops just defect rather than attack Ukrainians. And how can we create a world where more and more people would do that? And I don't know the answers, and hopefully someone else does. I mean, I certainly think that if we invested as much resources in peace and prevention, we would have as many peace experts and creative peace experts as we do currently have war experts. And then there'd be people who's much smarter and much more full of expertise than any of us on this call who could answer that question.
I certainly agree that with something you just said, Jamie, and that is that when someone is knocking on your door or barging through your door, the peace testimony, pacifism, is a difficult thing to summons in yourself. But I think long before that, the Quakers have a particular understanding of, I don't know a different word to use than mediation. A long time ago, when I was a member of a different meeting from Sandy Spring, they paid me and another group of people to go to mediation training, which actually started in Maryland, was invented in Maryland, and then they developed a phenomenal training program. What is mediation? How do you develop the skill of mediation? And when and where do you use it? Can you use it professionally? Do you use it simply as a person in your regular life? All of the skills that I learned in that mediation I still use regularly among family members and among people. And I use it professionally. I hope that means that I'm actually teaching it as I live my life. I think those are skills that we need. And I don't think an esoteric discussion of peace, I think that discussion is very titillating to our minds, but I don't think it adds to our skill. And I think we could add to our skill, and it would be helpful to the world in general to spread the skills of mediation. Nora, to something that you said about stress affecting in utero babies. Yes, yes, yes. And in my profession, I deal with the result of that at 40. That's another arena in which Quakers, especially, because we have questions and not always answers, can be really helpful to people who are under stress. And I don't know that we extend ourselves in that way. We are doing that now with Afghans whose mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, children have been killed in front of them. And they are now here. How will they live? How will they survive? Where will they put that vision, that experience? How can we help that? We can give them food and we can find them jobs and houses, but how will they survive? How will they contribute to our society? I think we have to ask those questions, and I think we have to man up, excuse me for that expression, and act.
Thank you, Linda, so much. Where is this mediation program taught?
So this is 25 years ago that I did this. And we did it in a community building in Bucks County. This is Pennsylvania. I believe that the same thing happens here. I think I haven't looked at this in a long time, Ellen, but I think if you look at mediation training in Maryland, I believe it sometimes is state sponsored. It was at that time fairly expensive. I think it was $700 or $800 to attend a 5-day twice training program, but the skills were profound and just brilliantly taught.
You mentioned that it had originated in Maryland.
It did.
Mhm. And so the way to find out more about it is through mediation training?
I would look up mediation training in Maryland and see what you find. I really haven't paid attention in a very long time, but it's immensely useful. It is also a skill that law firms sometimes hire. Doesn't have to be done by a lawyer, but it's very useful in conflict situations. But the skill is useful when your kids are fighting with each other over whatever, or in meeting when we have really huge differences of opinion, or in our communities, everywhere.
Thank you.
I had a follow-up comment. I'm putting it in the chat. ecodefense.ru may be a connection if you wish to connect directly with people active in Russia, in the green and peace movement, if you will. I was part of a conference that they put on in Kaliningrad and Kgrad, one of the most, I guess, forbidden cities during the Soviet era, if not the most. But they're across Russia. And things that's an issue there is there's a company called Rosatom, which is the actual economic power base of Putin, sort of controls half the world's uranium. And the US is still purchasing that. There's no, what do you call it, sanctions on that uranium for US reactors and weapons production, as far as I know. And second, I don't know if anything has ever been written much about what friends are doing out of friend's house, but one of the most interesting talks I ever had with a friend was
You're frozen.
a girlfriend, if you will, of Raymond Wilson. Sorry, someone said something?
You were frozen. We didn't hear what you said.
A second. Okay, I'll start again.
It was just when you started talking about something, the most interesting thing at friend's house. That's when it cut out.
That was spending a day or an afternoon with Holder Randall, Randall. She was like a girlfriend or friend of Raymond Wilson. I spent quite a bit of time with Raymond Wilson and learning how to write about some of this stuff over quite a few years. And Hulda fed children, a lot of them, through the AFSC, CFSC, BFSC programs, as it were, across Europe. So she was in Russia quite a bit too. I don't know if anything was ever written about from her perspective. She was one of the only friends I've ever met who really knew what the Palestinian flag was, that sort of thing. She was a very, very interesting person. I don't know if there's ever been any attempt to understand what friends did at that perspective, at that depth or not, but she was very unusual. Her name was Hulda Randall, Randall. And I'm sending the link for ecodefense.ru.
I just looked up mediation training in Maryland, and it looks like Montgomery College has a 40 hour training session and they're also something offered by the court system and the Maryland Bar Association.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you.
Maybe also the American University School of International Service. I helped to start that program. It's a peace and conflict resolution program, so there's a lot of people working on mediation there. It's in DC.
Right. Thank you, Paul. Is the woman you mentioned still living?
I doubt it.
Because
She was missing both legs below her knees when I talked to her, and she was in her 70s, so that's quite a long time ago. But
yeah.
I did not know there were Quakers like that until I met her. I was just amazing talking with her. She was incredible what she had done. You know, millions of children they fed. But she also had an understanding of green and environmental issues. So it's just very deep.
Sure, yeah. And when you mentioned friend's house, did you mean in Moscow or here?
No, I meant friend's house in Sandy Spring.
Uh-huh.
She was living there, like I said, a girlfriend of Raymond Wilson. Raymond Wilson lived there for a while too. You know, he loved his flowers.
That's right.
But when he retired, he was looking for something to do, and he met me, and I needed someone to help me how to write to start the program on conflict resolution mediation at American University. So I met with Raymond once or twice a month for 2 or 3 years. And Huldah Randall was a person he really wanted me to know. I was in friend's house in Sandy Spring.
And do you think that she lived here at friend's house?
She was there, I think, for 5 or 10 years. You're in friend's house.
Yeah, I'm at friend's house.
Okay, sure. Yeah, but this was back in the 1980s. Way back in the 1980s when Randolph Forsberg was starting Nuclear Freeze, for example.
Yes.
I met her a few times, but to write, I went to Raymond Wilson and to Huldah Randall.
Well, thanks very much. Interesting. And Robin, if Jamie is still here, we should, I want to thank him for bringing up the idea of advocacy teams with FCNL and wondering whether the meeting has members who would be interested in becoming an advocacy team. We tried here at Friend's House, but we didn't have much response. One person and I were interested, but the other person is very involved with the policy committee of FCNL, and she didn't feel that she could take on participating in an advocacy team. But if anybody's interested, and I don't know, I know Patty was on this earlier, and I don't know if Michael Conklin is interested in as our representative to FCNL in helping to create an advocacy team to lobby. It's mainly for lobbying Congress on important issues regarding war and peace. So
yeah, I'm glad you highlighted that again, because to the friend's point earlier that we want to do more than have conversations that interest us about peace. We want to get out and make a more peaceful world. And I think these teams are a really, really good way to do it. I keep feeling sort of disheartened by how little international policy is an issue in American elections these days. And I think that this is a really concrete way to elevate that issue with members of Congress and make sure they are prioritizing not killing people in foreign policy.
Jamie, would you be willing to share the presentation that you made? I understand that it's being taped, but I would like to have those, all the graphs that you showed.
Yes, I can absolutely send around the slideshow that I made.
That would be absolutely great. If you send it even to one of, maybe Nora, can you receive it?
He
And-
could actually, he can send it to Jim, the meeting coordinator.
Okay, yes, yes,
and
yes. of
Jim
course.
can put it in, we can get it in the silent announcements for everyone.
Oh, that would be great. That would be wonderful. I would really like to look at that and ponder that. I've never seen statistics on peace. Imagine that. I mean,
Happy to share.
crazy. Yeah, I greatly appreciate the work you did on that. That's very meaningful to me.
Jamie, do you have that meeting coordinator email? We'll get it to you if you don't.
Yes,
Okay,
I
great.
have that. I can send it.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you to the meeting for hosting this. There's so much that can be said. I'm going to leave now, so thank you very much.
Thanks to Ministry and Council. And thank you, Jamie, for joining us and taking the time to help us.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm sorry I couldn't be in person. Sorry I had to be on the phone for the second half.
And thanks to
you very
Robin.
much. Thank you very much, Jamie. That was really enlightening, and it was really interesting seeing the track, seeing the change over time, the trends over time. That was very, very cool. Thank you very much. And I like the idea of the advocacy teams. That's great that you presented that as an option. So thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Robin, for coordinating.
Right.
And to
Yeah,
Barb
thanks, Rob.
Platt. And to Barb Platt. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all very much.
Robin,
Thank
call
everyone.
me. Hey, Robin.
I'll call you.
Hey, Robin. Yeah, call me. Thanks.
I'll
Bye,
call you.
guys.